Hello and welcome to a very special program. Today we are looking at a book which aims to put an end to the controversy on the circumstances of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose's death. Netaji is one of India's greatest heroes, and what he did in his lifetime remains an inspiration for millions of people, not just in India but around the world. But the controversy, particularly in recent times, on what happened that fateful day when he was in a plane crash, what happened to him afterwards, did he die in Taipei, did he go on to live for a longer period of time, did he travel to other countries, has been a debate that has continued in India for a very long time. In this book, laid to rest the controversy over Subhash Chandra Bose's death, Ashis Ray, a veteran journalist of 40-odd years, perhaps the longest-serving Indian journalist who's been reporting both from India, the UK and around the world, has really worked for a very long time to come out with a lot of research in this book, which he hopes will put an end to this controversy. We're very privileged to have Mr. Ray with us in the studio, and very, very privileged to have Dr. Anita Pfaff, Netaji's daughter, on this program as well. Professor Pfaff doesn't appear on television very often, and it is genuinely a huge honor to be speaking to you, ma'am, and somebody who's no stranger to television in our country, Professor Sugata Bose, the Trinamool MP, also Harvard historian. Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Ray, to you first. To what extent has the National Archives opening up its records for the first time, something done by this government, helped you once and for all end the controversy, you believe, on the circumstances of Netaji's death?
I don't think, if you're referring to the declassification
Yes.
of files by Narendra Modi, helped me to my research. What it did was to ratify what I had researched and what I had already found out. And it was good that everything in the files which had remained classified for so many decades eventually came out, and the truth was there for all to see.
Would you have written the book had those files not been declassified?
I would probably have written the book anyway, because I had enough information. It was a matter of timing. As it so happens, Modi decided to declassify the Netaji papers, as they are called. They're now a part of the National Archives in India, but I had already done a lot of work in the National Archives in Britain.
Yes.
And of course at the British Library.
Yep.
Apart from the visits that I had made to Taiwan, to Japan, the Russian papers that I collected, and many others which I've put together. Importantly, an interview with Naimur Rahman, the son of Colonel Habibur Rahman, who was Netaji's ADC and was fortunate enough to survive the crash.
Professor Pfaff, you've written the introduction to this book. In as much as Ashish says that, look, the controversy is over, it's over and done with, let's move on, and let us remember and honor the memory of Netaji, do you believe we in India can well and truly do that until such time as his remains come back to India from Japan, where they are stored at the Renkoji temple, and a DNA test is conducted?
Well, of course, I'm very glad that these documents, which are not precisely new, as Ashis Ray just pointed out, they have been around, but I think not easily available to many interested readers. It should be very helpful to have a collection of these documents. As far as I'm concerned, I have been convinced that my father passed away following an air crash in now Taiwan, then Taihoku, in 1945 for many years. And certainly if these documents help to clarify some matters for others, it should be helpful, and eventually if we decided that we could bring back the remains of Netaji to India, I think it would be a late homecoming for him.
Professor Bose, assuming that someday, hopefully sooner than later, those remains are brought back to India, from a scientific standpoint, given the fact that it's been so long, would we still be able to get, to the best of your knowledge, an accurate DNA fix? Professor Bose?
As a historian, I have looked at all the evidence, and I have written about this in the final chapter of my book, His Majesty's Opponent, in a chapter titled A Life Immortal. I would give the most importance to the eyewitness testimonies of those who survived the air crash. We must remember that we have the testimonies of 6 of the 7 survivors, of the doctors who attended to him at the Taipei military hospital, which the Japanese were running at the time. I was very moved to read the graphic account of an interpreter, Juiki Nakamura, who had met Netaji 4 times before while he traveled via Taipei between Tokyo and Singapore, who came and was there in his last moments. And of course, the most important eyewitness testimony is that of Habibur Rahman. So it's on the basis of this kind of direct witness evidence that I have no doubt in my mind that Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose died a hero's death, a martyr's death on the battlefield, fighting for India's freedom on the 18th of August, 1945. In fact, General Shidei, a top-ranking Japanese general who died in the same crash, his report says that it was death by war. Mm-hmm. And it was a similar death for Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. As for the scientific DNA test, you know, I'm open to it if it is possible, but after a cremation, usually, DNA material gets destroyed. We were able to identify the Tsar's family because they had been buried. So I think there is overwhelming direct eyewitness evidence for us to have come to this conclusion. And I really do hope that we can go beyond the fruitless controversy of his death, right, and focus on his life and work, which remains extremely relevant, as you pointed out at the outset of this program.
Mr. Ray, would you agree? Yes, there may be overwhelming evidence, but this is somebody who strikes a chord with us, always will strike a chord with us. And in as much as you've done this incredible work of history, look, until the remains are brought back, will the final controversy actually be over? So Professor Bose seems to indicate that, look, we already know so much. Do we really need to do this? Do you believe the remains should still come back to India?
The remains should certainly come back to India.
Yeah.
And all I would say is this, that in 1995, when I proposed a DNA test to the then Indian Prime Minister, P.V. Narasimha Rao, I felt that by going ahead, or at least attempting a test which would not have been easy, because a test on cremated remains is not easy.
But can it be done?
Well, we'll have to wait and see whether it can be done, but it's still going to be very difficult. Having said that, DNA technology has moved forward by 22, 23 years since I made that proposal. At that point of time, I felt that to satisfy everyone scientifically, perhaps a DNA test was the right thing to do. But today, there is so much more additional overwhelming evidence, I don't think it's really necessary. I think the remains should come back to India anyway.
Professor Pfaff, what are your views on this? That it's enough for the remains to come back to India, where they need to be honored in our country, or do you believe they need to come back and a DNA test, it's imperative for a DNA test to be conducted? As his daughter, what do you believe?
For me, the DNA test is personally not important. The only reason why I think it would be advisable if it could be done, as it was pointed out before by the other 2 speakers, that is by no means certain. But if it could be done, it certainly would convince some people who today doubt that he died in the plane crash, but who are sort of amenable to rational thinking. And the wider the support for this, the better it would be, because I think we would all not do Netaji a great service if, when his remains are brought back to India, great opposition and controversy remains to insult him, essentially.
Mr. Ray, you have a picture over here. I'm just going to try and show it if we can, of you in your travels in 1995 in Miyazaki in Japan, where you met somebody who treated Netaji after the plane crash at the Japanese military hospital. Could you tell us a little bit about this picture? What was the conversation? What answers did you get? Were you satisfied with the answers that you get?
First of all, the photo is of Dr. Yoshimi, who was head of the military hospital in Taipei, where Netaji was taken after being critically wounded as a result of the plane crash. He had third-degree burns. There were 3 doctors altogether who treated Netaji, and he was the head doctor. Under him was Dr. Suruta, who possibly spent more time than anybody else at Netaji's bedside before he passed away. But Dr. Yoshimi, who I met at Miyazaki in southern Japan, I remember flying from Tokyo to Miyazaki on a very stormy day and going and meeting him at a hospital that he had established after the war. And there he narrated in great detail what happened, how Netaji was brought into the hospital, the treatment that was administered, and how he passed away that same evening of the 18th of August, 1945.
Yeah. Professor Bose, Purabhi Roy, the historian, has a somewhat different account from what you may believe. She says, and this is something that she said in a very recent article, the Mukherjee Commission has already proved that he didn't die in a plane crash at Taiwan in 1945. Of course, the Mukherjee Commission's report wasn't finally accepted, but she still says this, and she also says the French archives have documents that find his mention till 1948. We don't know what happened to him after that. I think the plane crash theory was a ruse, and the Union government should look into it with a fresh perspective. How would you respond to that, sir?
Well, so far as the French story is concerned that's been circulating of late, that's actually totally absurd. I mean, there were a number of intelligence agencies, British and American, who were still not absolutely sure. For example, even the British were saying in February of 1946 that we have to find out whether our opponent is permanently dead. That was the phrase that they were using. They were unnerved by the Red Fort trial and the naval mutiny between November 45 and February of 1946. But there were 5 very close companions of Netaji who saw him off at Saigon Airport on the 17th of August of 1945. And then we have so many eyewitnesses of the air crash and of his death and the cremation that, historians typically give the greatest importance to eyewitness testimony. And that is what I have relied on to come to my conclusion. And Ashish has done a service by bringing together the most relevant documents in this compilation. I remember in the 1990s, my father, Dr. Shishir Kumar Bose, had suggested to the government that it should be the central government which should put together all of the relevant documents and publish it in the form of a white paper. The Shanawaz Committee of 1956 had access to the largest number of eyewitnesses. The Khosla Commission also had access to some of the eyewitnesses. But in the late 1990s, it was too late. And I think the Mukherjee Commission was open to all and sundry, relating the most absurd stories about sightings of Netaji. And that was not the way to show respect to Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. You were just talking about Dr. Yoshimi. I have read Dr. Yoshimi's interrogation report in a Hong Kong jail taken by the British in 1946. And this doctor repeated exactly the same account to the Shanawaz Committee in 1956 to the Khosla Commission in the early 1970s, to Ashish when he went to see him, and so forth. So I think that the weight of evidence is very, very strong, and we really, need the younger generation to come to terms with the mortal end of someone who will always be a deathless hero in a much deeper sense.
Mr. Ray, Justice Mukherjee had visited the airport in Taipei and the crematorium. He apparently found no documents to corroborate the plane crash and the burning of the body. There were 131 witnesses. Professor Bose says that, these were people who just heard stories and came and deposed. But there were 131 witnesses. They were called witnesses. Only 7 said that they believed in the plane crash theory. Why is that the case?
I don't think a lot of people have understood what the state of affairs in Taiwan was on the 18th of August 1945. In that country, which was under Japanese occupation, it was completely chaotic. On the 15th of August, 3 days before Netaji died, Japan surrendered in the Second World War. The entire Japanese nation, all Japanese forces, wherever they were in a state of shock. And in that state of shock, what they did or did not do does not mean that Netaji did not die as a result of the crash. When the Mukherjee Commission took place, none of the survivors of the crash, as Sugata has mentioned, there were 7 survivors, out of whom 6 gave evidence, not once, but several times. There were 3 doctors, there were nurses, there was Juichi Nakamura, the interpreter who knew Netaji from the past and who was at his bedside when he passed away. So all these people have given testimonies, first-hand, eyewitness testimonies, which cannot be washed away. One thing I will say, that the Mukherjee Commission claimed that there was no newspaper report about the crash in Taiwan. That is not true. My book brings out the newspaper report that people have been saying does not exist.
What did it say?
Which basically was a press note from the Japanese military authorities saying that Subhash Chandra Bose had died.
Professor Pfaff, there's a bit in the book, in the introductory chapter which you've written, where you've said, for me personally, this fact was brought home most strikingly when I had the opportunity to be present during the interview of one of the survivors of the plane crash by Professor Leonard Gordon in Tokyo in 1979. The fact that, the circumstances of Netaji's death. Could you tell us about what happened in 1979, that particular meeting, what you heard, and your memories of that meeting?
Well, it's quite a while back, but I recall that I joined Professor Gordon in his interviewing one of the survivors of the plane crash, and he had been present and injured as well. And he described how my father had been given a sweater because it was quite cold, and as when the plane crashed, the tank for additional fuel, which was not very far from him away, ruptured or something, and his sweater was partly soaked in petrol, and this is one of the reasons why he was injured very badly when his sweater caught fire, because it was soaked, and he gave a very convincing account of what happened. And I think other eyewitnesses, where I had not been present evidently, as the protocols show, also did the same. And just a comment on the Mukherjee report. The Mukherjee Commission, or Judge Mukherjee, comes to the conclusion that Netaji was in Taiwan on the 18th of August 1945. But he has no written evidence of what happens before or after.
There are a lot of people who would still insist, despite the book, despite your work, that there's been a Gumnami Baba, there's been a Bhagwanji. You know, I know as a historian, you reject this, you base your work on what you have seen and what you've read. But the fact is that Netaji is, in a sense, larger than life. He'll always be that. And in our country, these myths, a lot of people believe, need to exist to keep alive the memory of the man. Is that something that you perhaps need to accept, in as much as you accept that, look, there is a body of work, you've spoken to people and others, and you've drawn your conclusion, but for others, the myth is required to keep alive the memory of Netaji?
Look, I know that there will always be myths and legends surrounding Netaji's heroic deeds. But, you know, the kinds of myths that have circulated of late are so bizarre and are so insulting to the memory of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose that I feel that it is necessary to ask our countrymen to face the truth. In particular, I would say that, to claim that some Gumnami Baba of Faizabad was none other than Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose is a gross insult. Justice Mukherjee had written a letter to me asking me to give a milliliter of my blood for some DNA test with a Gumnami Baba. And I responded saying that I would not, because I cannot insult Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose in this way. So there will be, there are different kinds of myths and legends. And I really do think that in order to focus on his life and work, we need to, face the facts about his mortal end. Yeah. I would favor bringing back the ashes or the mortal remains, but if it can be done in a very dignified way, with the highest levels of government in India and Japan cooperating. I was recently in Japan. I visited the Renkoji temple, as I always do when I go there to give academic lectures. It's a very peaceful atmosphere. It was a beautiful experience for me to light 3 incense sticks and to ring the bell twice in memory of our great leader. I have also been to Taiwan, and I've cross-checked the geography with the accounts of the eyewitnesses. I have been to the hospital. I have been to the place where the crematorium used to stand. It's not there anymore. I have been to the Nishihonganji temple, where his remains were kept, where Habibur Rahman and Nakamura brought the remains before they were transported to Tokyo and placed in the Renkoji temple. And it is in some ways a very moving experience every time for me to go to Japan. But ultimately, a time must come when the mortal remains of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose should find its place somewhere in Delhi. He had wanted to reach the Red Fort of Delhi. They should be brought back to his motherland. And I hope that that will happen. After all, our prime ministers, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, have all visited the Renkoji temple. So there is a contradiction in our government's approach to this question, which I hope will be resolved. Right. And a day will come in the not too distant future when Netaji's remains are brought back with the highest honor to his country.
It's been a real honor speaking to all of you. We are completely out of time, and congratulations on your book. And let's hope that I would assume the controversy is over, and one can only hope that the family also, the extended family, accepts this. Thank you all very much for being with us.